When Arman Halim first met the man who would later turn his world upside down, he saw only a thin figure bent beneath the sun, sleeves rolled high, hands stained with grease and rust, sorting metal pieces beside a rattling cart. The scrapyard lay at the edge of the city where the road thinned into dust, and the air smelled of iron and heat, a place Arman visited only because it sat between his rented room and the small engineering workshop where he worked for modest pay. Arman was not a man of privilege. His days were shaped by discipline learned early, by a mother who stitched late into the night after his father passed, and by a belief that dignity came from effort rather than applause. On that afternoon he stopped because the old man's cart had tipped, scattering scrap across the road, and cars honked without slowing. Arman pulled over, jumped out, and began to help without asking questions. The old man looked up, surprised, his eyes sharp despite his age, and thanked Arman with a nod that carried weight beyond words. They worked in silence, lifting bent rods and coils, and when the cart stood upright again, the old man smiled as if a private door had opened somewhere deep inside him. The old man introduced himself simply as Rahim, a scrap dealer who collected what others discarded and made a living from patience. Arman shook his hand and said his own name, explaining he was late for work but could spare a few minutes. Rahim waved it off, offering him a cup of tea brewed on a small burner near the yard, tea that tasted smoky and honest. They spoke of little things at first, the heat, the city's noise, the stubbornness of metal. Rahim listened closely, asking about Arman's work, his ambitions, his family. Arman answered plainly, never exaggerating, never complaining, and Rahim watched the way he spoke about money with respect rather than obsession. When Arman finally left, Rahim pressed a folded note into his hand as thanks, but Arman returned it, saying help was not a transaction. Rahim laughed softly, a sound that carried memory, and said they would meet again. They did often. Over the following weeks, Arman stopped by the scrapyard to share tea and conversation, sometimes helping lift heavy loads or fix a broken wheel. Rahim told stories of cities he had seen and markets he had known, of deals won and lost, all framed as lessons about trust and timing. Arman listened, absorbing wisdom without realizing the test unfolding before him. He spoke too of Sarah, the woman he loved, a designer with a quiet confidence, who worked hard and dreamed of building something lasting. Arman never mentioned her family beyond saying they were private and traditional. He loved Sarah not because she made life easier, but because she made it braver. When he asked Rahim what he thought about marriage, the old man looked at him for a long moment and said, a good marriage was built like a bridge, strong enough to carry weight, flexible enough to survive storms, and honest about its foundations. Unknown to Arman, Rahim was no scrap dealer. He was Rahim Qureshi, a self-made millionaire whose companies recycled metal at industrial scale, supplying factories across the region. He had risen from nothing, learning the language of scrapyards before mastering boardrooms. Wealth had come, but certainty had not. His only daughter, Sarah, was his pride and his worry. He had watched men approach her with smiles sharpened by calculation, and he had learned that money attracted mirrors rather than windows. When Sarah told him about Arman, his work, his kindness, his refusal to borrow against the future, Rahim decided to see for himself. He chose the costume he knew best, humility. He wanted to test not Arman's intelligence but his character, not his ambition but his integrity. The test deepened when Rahim feigned hardship. One evening he told Arman his cart had been confiscated by local officials, demanding a bribe he could not pay. He spoke with practiced resignation, watching closely. Arman offered to help without asking for proof, spending days negotiating politely, refusing to escalate, using reason rather than anger. When the cart was returned, Rahim observed how Arman never mentioned it again, never sought credit. Another time, Rahim claimed illness and asked Arman to mind the yard. Arman did so faithfully, refusing payment, keeping careful accounts and returning every coin. Rahim noticed the way Arman treated the poorest sellers with respect, never pressing for advantage, and the way he corrected mistakes in his own favor. Each observation stacked like steel beams, building something solid inside Rahim's chest. Yet Rahim also tested temptation. He offered Arman a chance to flip a shipment of copper for quick profit, suggesting corners could be cut. Arman declined, explaining that profit gained by bending truth weakened the hands that held it. He spoke not as a saint but as a man aware of his limits. Rahim smiled and said nothing. The city watched silently as the play unfolded, unaware that the smallest gestures were being weighed by a man who had learned to measure souls by ounces. The turning point came on a rainy evening when Sarah visited the scrapyard, umbrella tilted against the wind. She laughed at the sight of Armand and Rahim, arguing about the best way to stack pipes, and Rahim saw how Armand softened in her presence without shrinking. Sarah introduced Rahim as a friend, and Armand greeted her with the same warmth he showed everyone, neither defensive nor performative. When rain flooded the yard, Armand stayed late, building channels to guide the water away from the scrap. Rahim watched from under a tin roof, rain streaking the air, and felt a rare calm. The test, he realized, was nearly complete. Rahim chose the moment of revelation carefully, because timing, like metal, mattered. He invited Armand to tea, not at the scrapyard, but at a modest cafe near the river. Armand arrived in his work clothes, apologizing for the grease on his hands. Rahim waved it away and ordered tea with the same simplicity as always. They spoke of the weather, of Sarah's latest project, of the city's hunger to grow. Then Rahim's tone shifted, becoming still. He told Armand there was something he needed to say, not as a test but as a truth ode. He described his real work, his companies, his wealth, the years of building and the cost it had taken. Armand listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than stunned. When Rahim finished, silence settled between them like dust after a truck passed. Armand broke the silence by asking why Rahim had chosen to hide. Rahim answered honestly, saying he had needed to know who Armand was when no reward loomed. Armand nodded, saying he understood the fear that came with loving someone deeply. He admitted the revelation changed things, but not what mattered. He said he loved Sarah for who she was, not for what she inherited, and that he had treated Rahim as a man because that was all he had known him to be. If Rahim wanted to judge him again, Armand said he would accept it, but he would not pretend to be someone else. Rahim felt something loosen inside him, a knot he had carried since success taught him to doubt. The days that followed were not free of tension. When Rahim invited Armand to his home, the scale of wealth was undeniable. The gates, the gardens, the quiet efficiency of staff. Armand navigated it with humility, greeting everyone by name when introduced, asking permission rather than assuming. He spoke openly about his plans, his limits, his desire to grow without shortcuts. Rahim tested him one last time, offering him a position in the company that came with prestige but required bending values. Armand declined, proposing instead to earn his place through merit, to start where his skills fit and rise as his work justified. Rahim accepted the answer, not as a concession but as a confirmation. Sarah watched these exchanges with a mixture of relief and pride. She had trusted her father's wisdom but feared the test might wound the man she loved. Instead, it had revealed him more fully. When Rahim finally asked Armand to marry Sarah, he did so not as a king granting favor but as a father offering trust. Armand accepted with gratitude that did not tip into awe, promising to protect and partner with Sarah, to build a life anchored in honesty. The city, when it learned of the engagement, buzzed with surprise, spinning stories about luck and fortune. Armand corrected those who spoke to him, saying luck was less useful than labor, and fortune was empty without purpose. The wedding was simple by choice, elegant without excess. Rahim insisted on honoring Armand's family as equals, seating them at the center, listening to his mother's stories, learning her recipes. He watched Armand move through the day, attentive to details, generous with time, steady in joy. In a quiet moment, Rahim pulled Armand aside and thanked him, not for passing a test, but for reminding him who he had been before money complicated the mirror. Armand replied that Rahim had taught him something too, that wisdom could wear many faces, and humility was the most powerful disguise. Years later, when the companies expanded into greener practices and the scrapyards became hubs of renewal rather than neglect, Rahim and Armand worked side by side. They disagreed often, debated fiercely, and laughed easily. The story of the scrap dealer who was not a scrap dealer became a family legend, told with affection rather than drama. What mattered was not the reveal, but the truth it uncovered. That character does not change when the curtain lifts. It is simply seen more clearly, and in that clarity, a family found its foundation, forged not in gold, but in steel strengthened by fire and cooled by trust.